The chopper blades were still spinning when I saw him standing on that porch, and for a second, everything in me went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 14 months of deployment. He had his hand on the doorframe like he owned it. He didn't own anything. Not that house, not that porch, and sure as hell not the little girl I could hear crying somewhere behind him. I stood at the bottom of the steps in a uniform still dusted with someone else's country, and I watched his face change when he realized who I was. That's where this story ends. Let me tell you how it started. I'd been in country for almost a year when my mother's call came through on a satellite line that wasn't supposed to carry anything but mission-critical traffic. My commander, a man named Colonel Reyes, 22 years in, the kind of officer who noticed everything and said nothing until it mattered, was standing 3 feet away going over grid coordinates when he heard my mother's voice crack through the static. She wasn't screaming. She was worse than screaming. She was trying so hard to stay calm that her voice kept breaking apart mid-sentence, and every time it broke, I heard my daughter's name inside it. "Your daughter's scared of him," she said. "She won't stop crying for you." I want to explain something about the version of me that existed before that phone call, because it matters for everything that came after. I was not an absent father by choice. I want to be clear about that, because for 2 years, my ex-wife's family had built a story about me that painted me as exactly that. The deployed dad. The guy who chose a uniform over a crib. The cautionary tale they told at holiday dinners when they thought I couldn't hear them, or didn't care that I could. My ex-wife, Danielle, had never said those things outright. She didn't have to. Her silence when her mother said them was loud enough. I met Danielle when we were both 23, and we had 4 good years before the distance started doing what distance does to people who don't fight for each other the same way. We split when our daughter, Emery, was 2. I signed every support check on time. I called every night I had signal. I sent letters that I know for a fact Danielle read to her before bed, because Emery would recite lines back to me on our calls, word for word, in that solemn 4-year-old voice like she was reading scripture. None of that mattered to Danielle's mother, Carol, who had decided somewhere along the way that a father who wasn't physically present didn't count as a father at all. Carol had opinions about everything. She had an opinion about my career, my choices, my worthiness. And when Danielle started seeing a man named Trent about 8 months before that phone call, Carol got a new favorite subject. How good he was for the family. How present. How normal. Normal. That word did a lot of work in that house. I kept my composure through most of it. I told myself that Emery's stability mattered more than my pride, that a 4-year-old doesn't need her father starting wars from 6,000 miles away over comments her grandmother made at Thanksgiving. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. There's an internal ledger everyone carries, even if they don't call it that. A quiet tally of every time you bit your tongue, every slight you swallowed for the sake of peace. And mine had been filling up for 2 years without me even noticing the weight of it. Carol implying I'd checked out. Danielle not correcting her. Trent's name showing up more and more in Emery's stories, spoken with a kind of careful, coached fondness that didn't sound like it belonged to a 4-year-old's mouth. Then came the call, and everything in that ledger got a number attached to it, all at once. My mother told me Emery had called her crying 2 nights in a row, saying she didn't want to go to Mommy's house anymore, because Trent yelled, because Trent grabbed her arm too hard when she wouldn't clean her room fast enough, because Trent had locked her out on the back porch for 20 minutes in the cold as a punishment while Danielle was at work. My mother had gone to Danielle about it. Danielle had brushed it off, said Emery was being dramatic, said Trent was strict but not unkind, said my mother was overreacting because she'd never liked him. Carol had actually laughed, said something about how maybe if Emery had a father who was actually around, she wouldn't be looking for reasons to cause drama. I did not say a word for almost 10 full seconds after my mother repeated that line to me. Colonel Reyes, standing across the tent with a coordinate map in his hand, had gone still. He'd heard the whole thing. Every commander I'd ever served under had a line they wouldn't let a soldier cross without checking in on them first, and Reyes crossed his arms and looked at me with an expression I'd only seen him wear twice before, both times right before he made a decision nobody expected. He didn't ask me what I wanted to do. He told me, "Captain," he said, "grab your gear. The chopper's waiting." I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, but that's not true. What I felt was a kind of cold clarity, the kind that settles into your chest right before you do something you can't take back. I wasn't flying home to have a conversation. I wasn't flying home to quietly slide back into the role of the dad who calls on Sundays and hopes for the best. I was flying home to be her father again, in every sense of that word. And if that meant becoming someone Carol and Trent and even Danielle didn't recognize, then that's exactly what I was going to become. The flight back took 18 hours across 3 connections, and I spent every one of them doing something I'm not proud to admit felt satisfying. I was building a case. Not out of vengeance. Out of necessity. I called my attorney, a woman named Priya Anand who'd handled my custody paperwork years earlier and never once treated my deployment status like a character flaw. I asked her what documentation I'd need if I wanted to pursue an emergency custody modification based on a child's safety. She asked me if I had anything beyond a phone call from my mother. I told her I didn't yet. She told me to get it. Texts, voicemails, anything Emery had said that could be time-stamped and verified. Anything from a teacher or a neighbor or anyone else who might have noticed something. I called my mother back and asked her to write down, in as much detail as she could remember, every single thing Emery had told her, with dates. I called Emery's preschool teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Okafor, under the guise of asking how Emery had been doing lately, and what she told me, unprompted, made my hands go cold on the phone. Emery had drawn a picture in art class 3 weeks earlier of a man with an angry red scribble for a mouth, standing over a much smaller figure. When Ms. Okafor asked who it was, Emery had gone quiet and said, "That's when Trent gets loud." Ms. Okafor had noted it in her file, as required, and had tried to reach Danielle twice. Danielle hadn't called back. That was the detail that confirmed it. Not proved everything. Not yet. But confirmed that this wasn't my mother being overprotective, and it wasn't a 4-year-old being dramatic. Something was actually happening to my daughter, and the people meant to protect her had decided it was easier to look away than to look closely. I didn't call Danielle. I didn't call Carol. I landed, changed out of my dress uniform into something that wouldn't announce me from 3 blocks away, and drove straight to the house I used to help pay the mortgage on, with Priya's paperwork drafted and a folder of documentation sitting on the passenger seat, like a loaded weapon I was hoping I wouldn't have to use. Trent was the one who answered the door. He looked exactly like I expected, comfortable in a house that wasn't his, wearing an expression that shifted from irritation to confusion to something closer to alarm in about 2 seconds flat. Once he processed who I was and that I clearly wasn't supposed to be standing there. Behind him, down the hallway, I heard Emery's voice, small and wet with crying, saying my name to someone. To Danielle, I found out later, asking when Daddy was coming home. I was already home. I didn't yell. I want that on the record, because everyone in that house expected me to yell, expected the returning soldier to come in hot, and give them exactly the unstable, absent dad narrative they'd built about me for 2 years. I didn't give them that. I asked, very calmly, to see my daughter. Trent told me this wasn't a good time. I told him it was the only time that mattered anymore. Danielle came around the corner then, Emery on her hip, and the second Emery saw me over her mother's shoulder, she practically launched herself out of Danielle's arms and into mine, sobbing into my collar in a way that told me everything my mother's phone call hadn't fully captured. Carol showed up 11 minutes later. I know it was 11 minutes because I checked my watch, because by then I was already narrating events in my head the way you do when you know you might need to repeat them accurately to someone with a badge or a bar card. Carol came in already talking, already performing outrage on Trent's behalf before she even knew what was happening, saying I had no right showing up unannounced, that this was exactly the kind of instability she'd always worried about, that I was scaring Emery worse than. She stopped herself before she finished that sentence. Somewhere in the back of her mind, I think she realized how it would sound. I set Emery down gently with my mother, who I'd had waiting 2 houses down the whole time, and I turned around and I laid it out. Not with anger. With paper. I told them about Ms. Okafor's file. I told them about the drawing. I told them I had already filed an emergency petition with the court that morning, that a caseworker had been notified per mandatory reporting protocol the second Ms. Okafor's documentation was submitted, and that there would be a hearing, not a conversation in a doorway, not a family argument to be smoothed over with Carol's opinions about my parenting, an actual hearing, with an actual judge, where every single thing that had happened in that house over the last 8 months was going to be examined by someone whose job was not to have a favorite. Danielle went pale. Trent started talking fast, The way people do when the ground they've been standing on turns out to be thinner than they thought. Carol, for the first time in 2 years, didn't have anything to say at all. The hearing happened 11 days later, in a courtroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, with Priya beside me and Ms. Okafor's written statement entered as evidence alongside my mother's dated notes and a pediatrician's report from an exam I'd requested the week before, which had documented bruising on Emery's upper arm consistent with being grabbed, not spanked, not disciplined, grabbed. Danielle sat 2 rows away with her own attorney, and I watched something in her face collapse when the judge read the pediatrician's findings aloud in that flat, procedural courtroom voice that makes even the worst things sound almost administrative. I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. I felt something heavier and more exhausted than victory, something closer to grief for the version of this family that could have existed if anyone else in that house had simply listened the first time. But I also felt, for the first time in 2 years, that the ledger I'd been carrying, every dismissive comment, every "he's just strict," every laugh at my expense from a woman who decided my uniform disqualified me from being a father, had finally been balanced by something that couldn't be argued away in a kitchen or laughed off at Thanksgiving. A judge, a record, a ruling. The court granted an emergency modification that day, primary custody transferred to me, pending a full investigation, supervised visitation only for Danielle until she completed a parenting evaluation, and a formal no-contact order between Trent and my daughter, full stop. Carol wasn't in that room to hear any of it, because Danielle, for reasons I understood only much later, had asked her not to come. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the family fell apart in some dramatic, satisfying way, because that's not what happened, and I think real endings rarely look like the ones we imagine on the flight home. What happened was quieter. Danielle completed her evaluation, did the work the court required, and slowly, carefully, earned back time with Emery, supervised at first, then not. She and I don't talk the way we used to, but we talk, and when Emery brings up that period of her life now, in the careful, testing way kids do when they're checking whether a subject is safe to touch, Danielle doesn't flinch from it or excuse it. She just tells her the truth, which is more than I expected and more than Carol ever offered. Trent, as far as I know, moved out of state about 6 months later. I heard through my mother that Carol still tells people I overreacted, that I used my military connections to steamroll the family, which is a special kind of rewriting history I've stopped letting bother me. I don't need Carol's version of events to be accurate. I only ever needed the court's version to be accurate, and it was. I finished out my remaining time in service with a transfer to a stateside post, close enough to coach Emery's soccer team, close enough to be at pickup more days than not, close enough that when she draws pictures now, and she still draws all the time, the people in them are smiling. I keep one of those drawings in my wallet, actually. It's not sentimental in the way people mean when they say that word. It's evidence, in its own way, of a case I already won. Colonel Reyes retired last spring. I called him the week after Emery's last soccer game of the season, mostly just to tell him how she'd played, and somewhere in that conversation I thanked him again for what he did that day in the tent. He said something I've thought about a lot since. He said a commander's job isn't just to send soldiers toward danger. It's to know when the real mission changed, and to have the sense to let a man go be who he actually needed to be. I've carried that with me since. I think about the version of myself that might have stayed quiet, that might have finished the deployment first and dealt with everything after, the version who let 2 more months of Carol's version of the story calcify into the truth by default. I didn't become that version. I flew home instead, and I stopped being the father they talked about in the past tense, and became the one standing in the doorway. If any part of this sounds like your family, if you've ever been the one written off, underestimated, or quietly outvoted by people who decided your version of the story didn't count, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop your story in the comments below. Sometimes the only thing that changes everything is one person finally deciding they're done staying quiet.